A young woman vanishes without a trace in the Pine Barrens, New Jersey, a place known for its dark legends and the oppressive silence that seems to swallow everything around it. Her sister, devastated by the disappearance, embarks on an obsessive search, braving the isolation of the trees, but soon realizes the forest is not just a place, it's a living, conscious presence, watching and manipulating her every move. As the protagonist's sanity unravels, she discovers the terror there is much older than any legend. Something ancient is awakening, and she realizes the forest hides more than the bodies of those who were never found. The Pine Barrens in New Jersey always seemed like a common place to the locals. An endless stretch of trees and trails, immortalized by the urban legends surrounding it. But for Samantha, that forest carried a different weight. Ever since her sister Emily's disappearance 6 months ago, she couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was alive, and that, in some twisted way, it knew exactly where Emily was. That morning, Samantha woke up from the same nightmare she'd been having. Emily walking among the trees, shadows dancing around her, until suddenly, she turned toward Samantha. But something was wrong. Her eyes were empty, lifeless. Waking up was a brief relief until the brutal reality of the disappearance hit again. Emily was missing, and the only clue was that forest. Since the official search had been called off, Samantha had thrown herself into an obsessive investigation. She revisited the trails, studied old maps, and read reports of previous disappearances. Pine Barrens had a long history of unsolved mysteries, but what haunted her the most were the local legends, stories of people who entered the forest and were never seen again. Some, the more superstitious claimed, were absorbed by the woods themselves, as if the forest swallowed them whole. Now, alone in her small house on the outskirts of New Jersey, Samantha could no longer ignore the call of the forest. It was as if something was pulling her, something invisible and powerful. The feeling grew stronger each day, an anxiety eating away at her mind. Emily's disappearance didn't make sense. There were no clues, no trail to follow. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. That night, unable to sleep, Samantha decided to return to the forest. It wasn't the first time she'd done this, but this time, something felt different. The air seemed denser, and the silence more suffocating. She walked down a narrow path, lit only by the faint beam of a flashlight, barely cutting through the darkness around her. The trees were massive, and at a certain point, the trail split into 3. She knew the correct path well, but something inside her, an irrational impulse, made her take the left trail, the one no one used. As she walked, the air seemed to close in around her, making each step heavier. The trees, once harmless, now appeared to be watching her, as if the twisted trunks were hiding eyes. Samantha began to feel a presence, something undefined, as though she was being followed. She stopped and looked back, but saw nothing. Yet the feeling persisted, like an invisible shadow following her closely. "Emily," she called, her voice barely rising in the thick air. There was no response, only the muffled sound of her own footsteps echoing. The forest seemed to pulse around her, as if it were alive, waiting for her to make a mistake. Each minute felt like it dragged on until Samantha noticed something strange. The path didn't seem familiar. The trees around her seemed closer than they should be, their shadows intertwining in bizarre shapes. The flashlight flickered, casting shadows that twisted into faces and figures she knew were impossible. "What's happening?" she murmured to herself, trying to push the panic away. But the air around her felt alive, moving as if the forest itself was breathing. She tried to calm herself, repeating in her mind that it was all just her imagination. Yet, she couldn't ignore the sound. A faint whisper, almost imperceptible, but undeniably present. It seemed to come from the trees, as if the leaves were trying to say something. Samantha turned off the flashlight for a moment, trying to orient herself in the oppressive darkness. That's when she felt it. A cold hand touching the back of her neck. She froze. The touch was light, but real, making her heart race. She quickly turned, shining the light around her, but there was nothing. Only the tall, still trees. She started walking faster, trying to ignore the feeling that something, or someone, was getting closer. The whisper grew louder, but now she could make out words. "Samantha. Follow." Her eyes widened. That voice, it was Emily's. She felt the blood drain from her face as her body froze. Instinct told her to run, but something else, something deeper, compelled her to keep moving forward, as if she was being guided by an invisible force. Walking almost automatically, Samantha followed the voice, going deeper into the forest. She knew it didn't make sense. Emily couldn't be there, but what if she was? What if something had really happened to her in that forest? What if the forest had decided to keep her? Before she realized it, she was in a clearing. The moon barely lit the space, but enough for her to notice something in the center, a stone, covered in moss, etched with symbols. She approached, but before she could make sense of what was happening, the ground gave way beneath her feet. It all happened so fast. A deep pit opened, and Samantha fell, the air rushing from her lungs. The sound of impact was muffled by the damp ground and the darkness that swallowed her whole. Samantha opened her eyes, but saw nothing except absolute darkness. For a moment, a claustrophobic sensation consumed her. She was lying on her back, partially submerged in something cold and wet. She tried to move, but her muscles felt stiff and numb. The fall had left her dazed, and the sound of her own breathing was the only thing she could hear. The first wave of panic hit her like a punch. Where was she? The hole in the clearing seemed far too deep to be natural, and the way the ground had simply given way beneath her feet was something she had never experienced before. With effort, she sat up, feeling around. The ground was smooth, like polished stone, and her hands found small rocks and patches of moss. But there was no visible way out. Trying to stay calm, she reached into her pockets. The flashlight. It was still there. With trembling fingers, she switched it on, and the light, which had seemed weak before, was now a momentary relief in the sea of darkness surrounding her. The flashlight illuminated a small area around her, but the space seemed to stretch far beyond what the light could reach. She was in some kind of cave, but the walls were covered in marks. Ancient symbols and shapes that didn't make sense, some looked like letters, others like twisted, inhuman faces. Samantha felt the familiar pressure in her chest, panic returning with full force. She tried to control her breathing, but every time she looked at those symbols, a deep sense of unease washed over her. Something was wrong with this place, terribly wrong. "Samantha, you're close." Emily's voice echoed again, but this time it wasn't a distant whisper. It seemed to come from all directions, reverberating off the cave walls, as if the very stone was speaking to her. The flashlight began to flicker, blinking in short, unpredictable intervals. Every time the light dimmed, the shadows on the walls moved, as if they had a life of their own. "Emily? Where are you?" Samantha's voice came out as a desperate cry. But the echo of her own voice made her shudder. She knew, deep down, that the presence speaking to her wasn't her sister. That couldn't be Emily. The flashlight went out completely, plunging her into suffocating darkness. That's when she felt the touch again. This time, it was a constant pressure on her shoulder, something cold and wet, like skeletal fingers gripping her skin. Her reaction was instinctive. Samantha leapt to her feet, pulling away from whatever it was, but the touch didn't disappear. "What do you want?" she screamed, terror taking over. But the only response came in the form of distorted laughter, multiple voices blended together, each one sounding both distant and close. Laughter that didn't belong to any human. Laughter that seemed to mock her, amused by her fear. Slowly, the flashlight's light returned, flickering faintly, and Samantha caught a glimpse of her surroundings. What had once seemed like a cave was now some kind of tunnel that stretched downward, curving into the darkness. The marks on the walls were moving, slowly, as if they were alive, forming patterns she couldn't comprehend. The symbols seemed to create eyes that watched her, observing her every move. She had to get out of there. Without thinking, Samantha ran down the tunnel. Her footsteps echoed loudly, amplifying the feeling that she wasn't alone. Every time the flashlight flickered, more grotesque shapes seemed to emerge from the shadows, long, thin arms, distorted faces with impossible smiles. But they all disappeared as soon as the light returned. "This is a nightmare," she murmured to herself as she kept running. Her lungs burned, and the sound of her own labored breathing was the only constant noise in the madness. The forest had never been a safe place, but this was something else. It was as if she had entered another plane, a distorted reality where time and space didn't follow the same rules. Suddenly, the tunnel began to narrow, forcing Samantha to slow down. With each step, she felt the walls closing in around her, and the claustrophobia returned with full force. The flashlight finally died, and now she was completely in the dark, unable to see a hand in front of her face. The smell of damp earth and something rotten filled her nostrils, making her stomach turn. "Emily?" she called again, but the voice that responded wasn't human. It was a low, guttural growl, coming from the end of the tunnel. She froze. The silence returned, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. Something was there, lurking, waiting for her to take one more step. Samantha felt a tremor run through her body. Everything inside her screamed to run, but where? There was nowhere to go. Then, suddenly, a faint light appeared ahead of her, at the end of the tunnel. An exit? A momentary hope. Samantha began walking toward the light, but each step was a mental torture. The persistent growl and the sound of something scratching the walls made her heart pound in her chest. When she finally reached the source of the light, she realized it wasn't an exit, but a small space, illuminated by a torch mounted on the wall. In the center of the space, there was a hunched figure, a woman with long, disheveled hair, her back turned to Samantha. Samantha felt the air leave her lungs. It was Emily. It had to be. "Emily?" she said, her voice now a trembling whisper. The figure slowly turned, revealing a face that should have been familiar, but was now distorted, covered in scars and shadows. And then, with a cold smile, Emily spoke. "Samantha. You finally arrived." Samantha froze. The figure before her looked like Emily, but something was profoundly wrong. Her sister's smile was twisted, lifeless, and her eyes, those eyes did not belong to a human being. They were deep, dark, empty, like something had drained all the humanity that once inhabited that body. "Emily," Samantha whispered, her voice shaky with fear and confusion. Logic told her this couldn't be her sister, but her heart refused to accept it. She was standing there, the same person Samantha had searched for tirelessly for months. Yet, at the same time, it felt like a corrupted copy, a grotesque version of who Emily once was. The faint torchlight cast shadows that stretched across the cave walls, creating distorted forms that moved in strange, unnatural ways, as if they were alive. Samantha felt the air around her grow thicker, suffocating. Every breath was a struggle, as if the environment was sucking away what little oxygen remained. "You're not here," Samantha said, trying to convince herself. You're not real." Emily's smile widened in a grotesque manner, and her voice came out as a hollow whisper, with distorted echoes that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond that space. "Real? Who said reality is what you think it is, Samantha? There are places where the rules don't apply, where the living and the dead coexist, where darkness reigns, and you, my dear sister, walked in willingly." Samantha took a step back, terror rising inside her. Emily's words echoed in her mind, eroding what was left of her sanity. It was as if, with every syllable, something inside her was breaking. The tunnel around her seemed to vibrate, and the shadows began closing in, as if they were physical entities, stalking her. "What do you want from me?" Samantha screamed, her voice trembling as she frantically looked around, trying to find a way out. But the tunnel seemed smaller, the walls closer, as if the cave was alive and ready to crush her. "Me? Nothing," Emily replied, slowly walking toward Samantha, her footsteps making a hollow sound on the stone floor. "But they do." Before Samantha could react, the torchlight went out in the blink of an eye, plunging everything into absolute darkness. The sound that followed was something she would never forget. Multiple distorted laughs echoed through the tunnel. They sounded human, but there was something viscerally wrong with them, something monstrous and insane. The laughter came from all directions, and Samantha felt the very ground vibrate with the disturbing energy that accompanied them. Suddenly, something touched her in the dark. A hand, cold and clammy, grabbed her arm. Screaming, Samantha tried to break free, but the hand held her with superhuman strength. The darkness seemed to pulse around her, as if it were a living entity, hungry and aware of her presence. "It's no use running, Samantha," Emily's voice echoed in the darkness. "You've entered a place where things don't follow the rules of the world outside. Here, time doesn't exist. Here, they decide what's real." Samantha struggled desperately, but the cold touch of the hand spread through her body, and a feeling of absolute panic consumed her. She didn't know where she was, what was happening, or what else might be lurking in that living nightmare. But then, a horrible thought crossed her mind. What if she never got out? What if she was destined to wander in that darkness forever, a prisoner of the shadows? The sound of the laughter intensified, distorting until it became guttural screams. Samantha could barely distinguish her own thoughts. The laughter seemed to mock her, as if the entities present were feeding on her growing fear. Suddenly, the hand holding her let go, but the panic remained. She stumbled, falling to the damp, cold ground, feeling the grime soak into her clothes. As she stood up, something changed in the atmosphere around her. A faint light appeared at the end of the tunnel, similar to what she had seen before. But now, Samantha knew that light did not represent salvation but a trap. Yet, she had no choice. Her mind was shattered, her will to fight exhausted. Letting the only source of light guide her, she began to walk again, her steps hesitant. The tunnel seemed to stretch, as if with every step, the exit grew farther away. Time felt distorted, the seconds dragging into an oppressive eternity. The light finally revealed a new chamber, larger than the previous space, and at the center of this chamber was something Samantha couldn't immediately comprehend. On the ground, drawn with unsettling precision, was a large circle made of strange, intricate symbols. Around the circle, objects were arranged: unlit candles, ancient amulets, and bones, many bones. And at the center of the circle, a hooded figure stood motionless. Samantha approached, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind teetering between absolute terror and an irrational need to understand what was happening. The hooded figure raised its head, revealing a face Samantha would never forget. It wasn't Emily. That was something much worse. The figure's eyes were hollow, yet they emitted an eerie, spectral light that froze Samantha in place. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. Time seemed to stop completely. And then, the silence was broken once more, but it wasn't a voice she recognized. "You've done what they wanted," the figure said, its voice deep and ancient, like the sound of rocks shifting beneath the earth. "Now, the cycle continues." Before she could react, the shadows around Samantha began to move, enveloping her. The sound of laughter and distorted screams returned with intensity. Something terrible was about to happen. The feeling of being watched, manipulated, intensified. The very air seemed alive, pulsating, waiting for something to burst from the abyss. Then, in one last moment of clarity, Samantha realized the cruel truth. She wasn't just lost in that forest or that cave, she was lost within herself, dragged by forces that had always been beyond her understanding. The shadows, the voices, the hooded figure, all were part of an endless cycle of terror that had begun long before her. The darkness swallowed her whole, and everything disappeared into a shapeless void. Samantha floated in the vacuum, lost between what remained of her sanity and the growing abyss. There was no way back. The hooded figure and the distorted laughter now felt like distant fragments, echoes of a nightmare that had no end. But suddenly, there was a rupture. Reality returned with unexpected violence. Samantha fell to the cold, muddy ground, gasping, feeling the wet earth beneath her hands. She was back in the clearing. The full moon hung above her, casting a pale, cold light over the scene. The smell of trees, of decaying vegetation, and the earth itself assaulted her senses, but now it was different. Something had changed forever. She was alone again. Samantha rose slowly, her body heavy, as if every movement required titanic effort. Her thoughts were hazy, confused, and for a moment she questioned whether what she had experienced was real. Yet, the marks on the ground around her, the circle of symbols still visible under the moonlight, made it clear that it wasn't an illusion. Her body trembled, and not just from the cold. It was fear, now deeply rooted in her soul. A part of her wanted to run, to leave the forest behind and forget everything. But another part, the one still seeking answers, refused to abandon the clearing. Something terrible had happened here. And though terror was woven into every fiber of her being, she knew she couldn't simply leave. Samantha staggered toward the center of the clearing. The circle of symbols, now partially erased, seemed to pulse beneath her feet, as if still imbued with a sinister energy. In the middle of it, something small and metallic glimmered in the moonlight. She knelt slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for the object. It was a locket. Familiar, worn, corroded with time. It belonged to Emily. As she held it, a wave of memories flooded her. Childhood with her sister, the laughter, the secrets they shared. But then more recent images came, the disappearance of Emily, Samantha's desperation, the relentless search. And finally, that cave. That hooded figure. The laughter that still echoed in her mind, mocking her failure. Samantha clenched the locket tightly, her nails digging into her palm. There was more to this. Something she still couldn't fully grasp. The clearing, the forest, the cave, all seemed part of a larger puzzle. but the truth, whatever it was, remained painfully out of reach. The wind picked up, making the trees around her whisper to one another. Samantha felt a presence. She wasn't alone anymore. Something was watching her, something beyond the reach of her senses, but whose presence was tangible. The air seemed to vibrate, heavy with an invisible, oppressive energy. She took a step back, her heart racing. The feeling of dread, which had briefly subsided, returned with full force. A shadow moved between the trees. It wasn't human, nor any ordinary creature. It was something primordial, an indistinct silhouette, but one that exuded a deep, indescribable terror. Samantha began to back away, stumbling over roots and rocks that appeared in her path. But no matter how hard she tried to retreat, the shadow seemed to draw closer, always present, always lurking. Her body was on the verge of collapse, her mind on the brink of complete destruction. Everything around her began to unravel. Reality fractured once more, and she realized that whatever that thing was, it wasn't a physical being. It was a manifestation of something far older and far more terrifying. Then, she heard a low, dragging sound coming from the clearing. A familiar voice, distorted but unmistakable. "You can't escape, Samantha. We are always here." Emily's voice. Samantha turned toward the source of the sound, but there was no one there. Only the darkness, the howling wind, and the circle of symbols on the ground. The terror now was overwhelming, as if the entire weight of the universe was pressing down on her shoulders, suffocating her. Every cell in her body screamed to flee, but her mind was trapped, unable to choose between running and surrendering to the inevitable. "Why are you doing this to me?" Samantha screamed, tears streaming down her face. "I came to save you. I did everything I could." But there was no answer. Only silence. And then, the laughter. That same grotesque laughter, now seeming to come from all sides. It was as if the forest itself was mocking her, as if the very ground beneath her feet was laughing at her despair. The world around her had become a prison of nightmares, and she was the center of that torment. But the response never came. Only silence. And then, the laughter. That same sinister laughter, now seeming to come from all directions. It was as if the forest itself was mocking her, as if the ground beneath her feet was laughing at her hopelessness. The world around her had become a prison of nightmares, and she was at the center of this torment. The laughter grew louder, but suddenly, something inside Samantha snapped. It was no longer fear, no longer despair. It was anger. Anger at being manipulated, at having lost everything, Emily, her sanity, and maybe even her own soul. Screaming with all her strength, she threw the medallion to the ground, the metallic sound echoing in the clearing. "If you want to destroy me," she shouted into the void, "then come. I have nothing left to lose." The laughter stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying, but Samantha didn't falter. She was on the edge of the abyss, but somehow, she felt stronger. The shadows around her retreated slightly, as if watching, waiting for her next move. The medallion, lying on the ground in front of her, began to glow again. There was something different about it now. A different kind of energy. Reluctantly, Samantha bent down and picked it up, and the moment her fingers touched the cold metal, she felt a wave of heat coursing through her body. It wasn't a comforting feeling, but something that made her feel awake. Something inside her had changed. And then, as if the forest understood the shift, the feeling of being hunted vanished. The shadows fully withdrew, and the sense of imminent danger dissipated. But Samantha knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end. The cycle hadn't been broken. It had merely changed its form. The nightmare, somehow, would continue. The cold forest wind persisted, but there was something different in the air now. Samantha, sitting at the edge of the clearing, looked down at the medallion in her hands, lost in deep thought. The night was quieter than ever, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. She knew something had changed, but wasn't sure if it was for better or worse. The clearing, with its marks of ancient rituals, still exuded a sense of threat. The shadows that once seemed alive now appeared dormant, like predators lying in wait. Samantha took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. Emily, her sister. Where was she now? That voice she heard, that laughter, still echoed in her mind, confusing her senses. There was an answer hidden deep within that mystery, but it felt unreachable. She looked around, sensing that the forest was still watching her. Even though the immediate danger had subsided, there was no guarantee she was safe. The feeling of being at the mercy of invisible forces still lingered in the air, and Samantha knew this wasn't the end of the story. Slowly rising, she took one last look at the circle of symbols on the ground. What the forest had revealed was only part of the puzzle, and she still needed to understand the whole picture. There was more behind that ritual, more about Emily's disappearance, and more about the role Samantha played in this story. Back in the city, Samantha barely recognized herself. The mirror reflected a pale woman with sunken, tired eyes, marked by sleepless nights. Her home, which once brought her some comfort, now seemed cold and distant, like an empty echo of the past. She spent hours wandering through the rooms, her thoughts invaded by the forest, the medallion, the shadows that had pursued her. The silence in her home was suffocating. She avoided answering the phone, talking to friends or family. Any attempt to return to normal life seemed pointless. The city of New Jersey, no matter how full of life around her, was to her just a faded backdrop, a facade of reality. Her real life now was in the forest. Or maybe it was more accurate to say that her real death was there, waiting for her. The nights were even worse. Every time she closed her eyes, Samantha was pulled back to that clearing, to the whispers in the wind and the invisible presence watching her. The dreams became an extension of the nightmare she had lived. Emily appeared in every one of them, always in the distance, always laughing, as if mocking her search. Sometimes Samantha woke up screaming, drenched in cold sweat, unable to distinguish between dream and reality. One night, after yet another one of those terrible visions, Samantha finally gave in. She knew she couldn't escape it, and the only way to face her fate was to return. There was a sense of resignation, but also a determination in her heart. The forest was calling her, and she couldn't ignore it. With the medallion hanging around her neck, as if it were a protective talisman, or a curse, Samantha got in the car and drove back to the forest. The winding road into the heart of the darkness felt familiar, yet strangely distorted, as if time and space were bending around her. By the time she reached the entrance to the trail, it was early morning. The moon hung above, just like before, casting its cold light over the dense vegetation. The silence was oppressive. Samantha stepped out of the car and began to walk. The weight of the medallion around her neck seemed to pull her toward the clearing, as if an invisible force was guiding her. As she entered the forest, the feeling of being watched returned with full intensity. Every leaf, every branch crunching beneath her feet seemed to whisper secrets, telling stories of ancient times. But now, instead of fear, Samantha felt something different. A strange acceptance. The clearing lay ahead, exactly as she had left it. The circle of symbols was still there, and the air around it seemed to hum with a latent energy, waiting to be awakened. Samantha stopped in the center of the clearing, her heart racing, but her mind clearer than ever. She removed the medallion from her neck and held it in front of her, staring at it. "You brought me here," she whispered. "So show me what's missing." The moment the words left her mouth, the clearing shifted. The ground began to pulse beneath her feet, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. The trees around her seemed to bow, as if they were witnessing what was about to unfold. The shadows, which had previously retreated, began to creep back, wrapping around her in a suffocating embrace. And then, the laughter. The same distorted laughter that had tormented her from the beginning. But this time, the voice wasn't distant. It was right next to her. "Samantha," the voice whispered, soft, almost tender. She turned sharply, and there she was. Emily. Not the Emily she knew, but a twisted version, wrapped in shadows, with a sinister smile on her lips. "You were always so close to the truth, but you never really knew what you were searching for." Samantha's terror was absolute, but she didn't back down. Instead, she gripped the medallion tightly, feeling the cold metal against her skin. "What do you want from me?" Samantha asked, her voice trembling but firm. Emily tilted her head, the smile widening. "I don't want anything from you." "But they do. They always have. And now you belong to them." The words pierced Samantha like knives. The world around her began to spin, and the ground beneath her feet cracked. She screamed, trying to hold on to reality, but it was too late. The forest, the clearing, existence itself was unraveling. And then, everything went dark. Samantha's disappearance became yet another local legend. The town of New Jesse, which already held dark stories, now had one more mystery to add to its collection. People spoke of the forest, of the ancient rituals, but no one dared to go near. Yet, on the darkest nights, the townsfolk claimed to hear distant laughter coming from the forest. Laughter that didn't belong to this world. And for those brave enough to venture into the depths of the dark forest, one warning lingered in the air: once you enter, the forest never lets you leave.